going on to Moody's now that says that manufacturing and infrastructure are going to be drivers of growth, Rakesh, for India.
Well, I mean, that's as per the script. It's not out of syllabus. We all know that India has really built massive infrastructure in the last few years, especially in the last 9 years. The pace has been phenomenal. It was the requirement of the day. But before I expand on the infrastructure piece, I think it's important to look at the story that you were just mentioning on the retailers' intervention. As Karthik rightly pointed out, there are two parts to it. One is the DOT, the Telecom Ministry, or the Ministry of IT Communications, because we do know, despite Digital India being celebrated at various quarters, the DND, a very basic function, has been a failure. We've not been able to enforce that. And so a blanket ban on retailers not asking for a mobile phone is not advisable for two reasons. Data is a virtue if it's used well. It becomes a vice if it's not used well. It becomes a vice when there are ethical issues and enforcement issues. If any sundry clerk at a retailer or a cashier uses the data without any supervision and sends it and sells it, actually it becomes a problem. That doesn't mean that data is not relevant to retailers or to the overall enforcement system. So misuse has to be prevented. For that, Karthik rightly mentioned, the Department of Telecommunication has to has to have more teeth. And second is that retailers need a lot of cash transactions happen. We've been on the 2000 rupee story, and we've seen that a lot of cash transactions are happening without a mobile phone. It's very difficult to link it to an individual who's using cash and making big ticket purchases. Second, there are discounts, there are loyalty programs, which are part of genuine, healthy marketing campaigns for any brand or for any consumption story. And India's consumption story is now fabled. In that sense, you can't take away those marketing initiatives from a retailer. And lastly, e-invoicing is happening in a big way. It's paperless, but e-invoicing, e-reports of whatever you do is phenomenal. I mean, you go to Dr. Lal Path Lab. I went some time back for a regular routine checkup, and there's no receipt now. Receipt comes on your phone. So if you divorce the mobile number from the transaction that you're doing, it's going to be very difficult, and you can't be selective. I completely agree with Karthi. You
Absolutely.
can't ask hoteliers to to ask for Aadhaar card, and then some hotels ask for double identity proof. And here you don't even give the telephone number. Yeah. Coming
Absolutely.
back to the
In fact,
infrastructure,
in
yeah.
fact, I went shopping this weekend, and my receipt came on my mobile phone, which essentially brings me to that very important point of how do you work around this? I mean, you want to go paperless on one hand, Rakesh. On the other hand, you can't block retailers from getting your mobile numbers.
I mean, it's a failure, complete failure of, despite Digital India, the Ministry of, the relevant ministry has failed to enforce misuse of data, number one. And, at a moral and societal level, we need to be a little more cognizant of, sharing that number with someone for some 100 rupees or 200 rupees. I mean, for my housing society, I don't know how many times that housing society directory has been sold, resold, for whatever little transaction. So I think there are societal issues, there are ethical issues, and there is an enforcement issue. And I do repeat, at the cost of sounding a little negative, that we failed to bring about, despite all the checks and balances, you get all kind of spam calls. They're always one step ahead of the curve.
True.
Coming back to the infrastructure story, I think the good news about infrastructure is that, while as it has been one of the key mainstays of this particular government, it will continue to be so the case for the next 1 year, which is critical year before we go to elections. So I don't see any letting down of the fervent push for infrastructure sector. And there are many projects which are on the, like linking Delhi, Dehradun in 2 hours, Delhi, Jaipur, 2 hours, which is closer home, so I can talk about it. But it's happening across big metros being connected to smaller towns, highways being built. There is a charge here that, the infrastructure development in India, especially the roads and highways, is little elitist. So, there are independent studies by think tanks which point out that if you go to a small village, India has 6.5 lakh villages, there is not much improvement there in the last 9 years. But when it comes to connecting highways with smaller towns, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 towns, there has been a growth. But so momentum will sustain. So Moody's is right, and the whole world is talking about infra and the digital stack as India's two growth stories. Uh, Talking about reforms, we all have been lamenting the lack of reforms in this particular episode for the last few years. In the second term, what was expected in Modi's government that there would be a massive buck up on reforms. Unfortunately, to my mind, I may be in a contrarian point of view. We went back on the agri reforms, which should have set up a huge facelift to the Indian economy. I'm not saying we need to be anti-farmer to do that. We need to be pro-farmer to bring about farmer reforms. We can get into the labyrinth of that in a subsequent show. But rollback of farm reforms is really unsettling and shows that this government, despite having the huge majority, is weak-kneed when it comes to reforms. And the reforms that Moody's is talking about are about opening up business, setting up businesses. I do remember having looked at business for the last 3 decades. This perpetual complaint by global investors about this single window being tom-tommed by each state government, and this very competitive investment shows and road shows happening in India and abroad. Even Mamata Banerjee going to Hong Kong, to US and UK, saying that please come to my state. But when it comes down to the micro, when the guy steps in, he gets the clearances, he needs that electricity connection at the plant. There are huge challenges still there. So the gap between the macro and the micro,
Right.
which is extremely relevant to business, is needs to be bridged.